There's a specific quiet moment that arrives inside a narcissist's mind, one he'll never describe to anyone, one he might not even fully admit to himself. The exact instant he understands, with total certainty, that this time you're actually gone. Not gone the way you've been gone before, during the previous ruptures, the previous silences, the previous times he assumed, with total confidence, that his usual tools would eventually bring you back into range. This is different. This is the moment the data finally, undeniably overrides the assumption, the moment his entire internal model of you, built over years of studying exactly how far he could push before you'd inevitably return, simply stops predicting anything useful at all. Today, we're going to walk through exactly how a narcissist arrives at this specific realization. Not the performed panic, not the manufactured crisis designed to provoke a reaction, but the genuine internal moment of understanding that he has lost you permanently. And by the end of this, you're going to understand something that reframes every strange, seemingly disconnected piece of behavior you might witness from him during exactly this period, whether you're watching it unfold right now or trying to make sense of it after the fact. Let's start with something crucial to understand about how a narcissist actually processes the concept of permanent loss, because it's fundamentally different from how most people process this same experience. For someone with a healthy attachment style, recognizing that a relationship has genuinely ended usually involves a relatively straightforward, if painful, process: grief, acceptance, eventual integration of the loss into a coherent understanding of what happened and why. This process, however difficult, follows a recognizable emotional logic, one built on genuine capacity for self-reflection and genuine tolerance for uncomfortable truths about one's own role in what went wrong. A narcissist doesn't have easy access to this same process, for reasons we've discussed extensively throughout previous conversations. His psychological structure isn't built to process personal loss through honest self-reflection, because honest self-reflection threatens the fragile, carefully maintained self-image his entire personality depends on protecting. This means the realization that he's lost you forever doesn't usually arrive through the kind of clear, linear emotional processing a healthier person might experience. It arrives instead through a slow, often resisted accumulation of evidence. Evidence his psychological defenses fight against accepting for as long as possible, until the weight of that evidence finally becomes impossible to deny any further. Here's the first piece of evidence that typically starts this process, and it's usually the one he can dismiss most easily at first: the failure of his opening tactics. Remember the pattern we've discussed throughout multiple previous conversations: the proximity testing, the casual contact, the low-stakes messages designed to check whether the door remains open without requiring him to risk genuine vulnerability by testing it directly. When these opening moves produce nothing, no response, no visible reaction, no confirmation that he still occupies space in your world, his first instinct isn't genuine realization, it's recalibration. He assumes his approach was simply miscalibrated, tries a different angle, waits for a different moment, convinced that the right combination of timing and tactic will eventually produce the response his historical experience has always taught him to expect. This is why the earliest phase of losing you forever doesn't actually feel, to him, like loss at all. It feels like a puzzle requiring a slightly different solution, a problem his confidence in his own competence assures him he'll eventually solve. The same way he's always solved this exact problem before, with you specifically, and with other people throughout his life more generally. The second piece of evidence arrives when escalated tactics also fail to produce results. This is where we start to see the vulnerability, the manufactured crises, the increasingly elaborate attempts to provoke some kind of reaction we discussed extensively in our conversation about what narcissists fear during no contact. When these escalated efforts also fail, something starts to shift in how he interprets what's happening, though this shift still doesn't yet constitute the full realization we're building toward today. At this stage, he typically moves from assuming the problem is tactical, the wrong approach, the wrong timing, toward assuming the problem is temporal. He starts telling himself a story about timing rather than a story about permanence. She just needs more time. She's still processing. She'll come around eventually, once enough distance has passed for her anger or hurt to fade. This story allows him to maintain his fundamental assumption that eventual return remains inevitable, simply requiring more patience than he initially expected to need. This is precisely why the middle period of losing you forever often looks, from the outside, deceptively similar to genuine patience or genuine respect for your space. He might actually stop reaching out for a period, not because he's accepted permanent loss, but because he's convinced himself that strategic patience represents the smarter play, the more sophisticated approach that will eventually produce better results than his earlier, more obvious attempts at contact. But here's where something genuinely significant begins to happen. Something that finally starts moving him toward the real realization this entire conversation is building toward. As this self-imposed patience extends longer than his internal model predicted it would need to, a specific kind of anxiety begins to intensify, one that goes beyond simple frustration at delayed gratification into something closer to genuine existential unease. Because remember what we discussed about narcissistic psychology and predictive competence. His entire sense of understanding how the world works, how relationships function, how his own tactics reliably produce outcomes, depends on this specific pattern eventually resolving the way it always has before. The longer this resolution fails to arrive, the more his confidence in his own predictive model begins to genuinely destabilize. And this destabilization produces something crucial to understand. It's not really about you specifically at this stage. It's about him confronting, for possibly the first time in his adult life, genuine uncertainty about whether his fundamental approach to relationships actually works the way he's always assumed it does. This uncertainty is deeply uncomfortable for someone whose entire sense of competence and self-worth depends heavily on believing his methods are reliable, effective, ultimately successful, regardless of temporary setbacks. This is where we start to see behavior that might initially seem contradictory to someone observing from outside. Increased desperation, mixed with apparent attempts at demonstrating indifference. Genuine anxiety masked by performances of having moved on completely. This apparent contradiction makes complete sense once you understand what's actually happening internally. He's oscillating between the old story, the one where eventual return remains inevitable, and a new, deeply uncomfortable possibility beginning to intrude on that story's reliability, one his psychological defenses are working overtime to keep at bay for as long as they possibly can. Let's talk about what actually happens once these defenses finally start to fail, because this is where the genuine internal realization we've been building toward finally begins to take shape, even though it rarely arrives as a single dramatic moment the way popular imagination might expect. Here's the crucial threshold. The moment he encounters undeniable evidence that contradicts his story so completely that no amount of recalibration or extended patience can reasonably explain it away any longer. This evidence looks different depending on the specific circumstances, but it typically falls into one of several recognizable categories, each one chipping away at the story he's been maintaining until the accumulated weight finally becomes impossible to sustain. The first category involves discovering that you've built something genuinely new, something that doesn't carry the markers of rebound or temporary distraction his psychology might otherwise use to dismiss it. This might mean learning, through whatever indirect channels remain available to him, that you've entered a relationship that appears stable, serious, genuinely different in quality from anything that might simply represent you filling the space he left. Or it might mean witnessing evidence of a life so thoroughly rebuilt around your own priorities, your own friendships, your own sense of purpose, that the specific shape of a life waiting for his return simply isn't visible anywhere within it. Here's what makes this particular category of evidence so devastating to his internal story. It doesn't just suggest you're temporarily unavailable. It suggests you've genuinely moved past needing anything from him at all, which directly contradicts the fundamental assumption his entire predictive model depends on. that his significance in your life remains permanent, regardless of temporary distance, waiting patiently for eventual reactivation whenever circumstances allow. The second category involves a specific kind of silence that differs qualitatively from ordinary no contact. Remember what we discussed about the emotional charge that typically accompanies genuine unprocessed attachment, even within silence itself. The way early no contact often still carries some residual intensity, some sense that the connection remains alive even in its current dormant state. As genuine healing progresses on your side, something shifts in how any remaining unavoidable contact actually feels, even in small incidental interactions that circumstances might occasionally require. If he encounters you in some context where interaction becomes briefly unavoidable, a mutual event, a practical necessity, any situation where complete separation simply isn't achievable, and discovers that your response carries none of the emotional charge his historical experience has always taught him to expect, whether that charge would show up as anger, as visible hurt, or even as barely concealed longing. This absence registers as something genuinely different from silence maintained through simple physical distance. It reveals something closer to complete emotional neutrality, the specific quality that comes only from someone who has genuinely, thoroughly processed and released their investment in the relationship, rather than someone who is simply avoiding contact while remaining internally unresolved. This specific quality of neutrality is often what finally, decisively breaks through his remaining defenses, because it can't be explained away through any of the stories he's been maintaining. It's not anger, which would suggest ongoing investment. It's not visible pain, which would suggest ongoing attachment worth eventually working to reactivate. It's simply calm, complete indifference, the exact quality that confirms, more definitively than any other single piece of evidence could, that his significance in your internal world has genuinely, permanently dissolved. Here's what happens internally once this specific realization finally, fully lands, and understanding this internal process matters enormously for anyone trying to interpret whatever behavior might eventually follow, whether you witness it directly or hear about it through indirect channels. The first response typically involves something we might call narrative scrambling, an urgent, often visible attempt to reconstruct the story of what happened in a way that protects his fragile self-concept from the full weight of what this realization actually means. This might manifest as sudden, intensified negative characterization of you and the relationship, retroactively reframing what happened in ways that position your departure as something he ultimately chose or welcomed, rather than something that happened to him against his will, something he genuinely couldn't prevent despite every tactic his historical experience had always taught him would eventually succeed. This narrative scrambling serves an important psychological function, even though it looks from the outside like simple denial or dishonesty. It protects him from having to sit directly with a truth his psychological structure genuinely struggles to tolerate. That despite everything he tried, despite every tactic that had always worked reliably before, this particular loss proved genuinely, permanently irreversible, in a way that suggests his fundamental approach to relationships might carry limitations he spent his entire life successfully avoiding having to confront. The second response, often occurring simultaneously or shortly after the narrative scrambling begins, involves what we discussed extensively in our previous conversation about genuine narcissistic breakdown, a kind of systemic destabilization that extends beyond simple sadness into something closer to genuine crisis. Precisely because the structures we discussed in that conversation, regulatory outsourcing, narrative infrastructure, predictive competence, are all simultaneously collapsing at once, without the buffer of continued hope that eventual return remains available to soften this collapse. This is precisely why the moment a narcissist genuinely realizes he's lost you forever often coincides with the most visible signs of struggle you might witness or hear about, whether that's uncharacteristic behavior, visible decline, or the kind of genuine unraveling we examined in detail previously. This timing isn't coincidental. It reflects the specific psychological mechanism we've traced throughout this entire conversation. The moment undeniable evidence finally overrides his sustained denial, the various supporting structures that denial had been protecting all collapse, essentially simultaneously, producing a crisis considerably more intense than what would occur if he'd been able to process this loss gradually, the way healthier psychological architecture might allow. Because here's what matters more than the mechanics of how he eventually arrives at this realization. Whether he ever reaches it at all was never actually something your healing needed to depend on. This is worth stating plainly because everything we've traced throughout this conversation, the failed tactics, the narrative scrambling, the eventual undeniable evidence, the systemic collapse that follows, can easily start to feel like the missing piece of validation you've been waiting for, the moment that finally proves the relationship meant something, that you weren't simply discarded and forgotten the way his early performance of indifference might have suggested. And there's a real temptation here, one worth naming directly, to treat his eventual realization as the finish line of your own story, the moment that finally, retroactively justifies everything you went through. It isn't, and it was never meant to be. His realization, whenever it arrives, however it unfolds, belongs entirely to his own psychology, his own reckoning, his own separate process that exists completely independent of yours. You don't need him to reach this moment in order for your own healing to be complete. You don't need confirmation that he's finally understood what he lost in order to know, with total certainty, exactly what you survived and exactly what you're worth. Here's what's actually useful about understanding this entire mechanism, and it's different from simple validation. Understanding how a narcissist arrives at recognizing permanent loss helps explain, with genuine clarity, why his behavior during any period of continued silence from you might shift unpredictably, might intensify before it fades, might produce confusing signals that would otherwise seem to contradict whatever narrative he's presenting publicly. This understanding protects you from misreading these signals as invitations, as evidence that re-engaging might finally produce the outcome you once hoped for. It doesn't. Whatever internal process he's moving through remains his to navigate on his own timeline, using whatever internal resources he actually has available, which we've discussed at length are often genuinely limited compared to what healthier psychological architecture would provide. There's something worth sitting with honestly here, something that resolves the emotional pull this entire topic naturally creates. Even in the moment he genuinely fully understands that he's lost you forever, this understanding rarely translates into the kind of transformation that would actually make him safe to re-engage with, even if some part of you found yourself tempted by the possibility. Genuine realization of loss and genuine capacity for the sustained relational change that would actually honor what a real second chance would require are two entirely different achievements, and the first almost never automatically produces the second, regardless of how intense or how genuine the realization itself might be. This is why the most useful thing you can take from understanding this entire process isn't anticipation of some eventual vindicating moment, but something more valuable: permission to fully release your own need for that moment to arrive at all. You get to build your life completely, peacefully, without requiring his internal reckoning as a precondition for your own sense of closure. Whatever he eventually understands about what he lost, whenever he understands it, however painfully that understanding eventually lands, exists in a category entirely separate from your own continued life, your own continued healing, your own continued forward motion. So if you find yourself wondering whether he's reached this moment yet, whether the reports reaching you through indirect channels suggest genuine crisis or simply performance, understand that the answer to this question, whatever it turns out to be, doesn't actually change anything about your own path forward. You already know what happened. You already know what you experienced, what you survived, what it cost you to finally, permanently choose yourself over a dynamic that was never sustainable in the way you deserved. His eventual understanding, whenever and however it arrives, simply confirms something you've likely already known for a very long time. You were never actually replaceable, insignificant, or easy to lose, but you were also never required to wait around long enough to watch him figure that out for himself. That understanding, whenever it lands for him, belongs entirely to his own reckoning. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, and share for more videos.